or standing for Remain. And the third bit was those people, particularly in the North and in the Midlands, who were Leave voters who no longer were prepared to support Labour if they didn't get Leave carried and the Brexit vote carried. So Labour was caught, in my view, between two stools. That in the minds of a sufficient number of people, not everybody, because you can't generalise entirely, but insofar as we can, they were caught between two stools, between those who wanted to leave the European Union and those who wanted to stay in, and Labour fell into the hole in between. Although they had a very good social programme, that didn't carry much weight when it came to the decision of a sufficient number of people. It's only sufficient because Labour still polled 10 million votes, the Conservatives polled 13 million, the Liberal Democrats polled 4 million. Labour wasn't annihilated. I hear in the newspapers, Labour had the worst results since the 1930s. Well, yes, in terms of seats in Parliament they did, but not in terms of the share of the vote. Actually, Corbyn, even the second time round, did better than a lot of other Labour leaders did, including Gordon Brown and so on, in share of the vote. But because the Scottish Nationalists took all the seats in Scotland, you remember, back in 2010, or even before that, Scotland was a Labour area. Nearly every seat was Labour. The Scot Nats had a few, Lib Dems had a few, the Tories had a few. Now, Labour is annihilated, apart from one Labour MP. Why is that? Well, that's a question we could perhaps discuss a little bit further. Is it entirely due to Scottish nationalism? We could come to that. Or is it more to do with what's been happening to Scotland and other parts of the country, particularly in the North and the Midlands and so on, over the last 10 years? Because it seems to me the other big issue that has hit people over the last 10 years in particular, since the Great Recession, which you can remember is a big slump in the world, which led to a decline in production and output and jobs and so on. And then we've had a really low growth rate, stagnating growth rate. In fact, up until very recently, real wages in the UK have been growing at their slowest for 167 years, according to the Bank of England. That's how poor the recovery has been since 2009. And of course, we know what has happened to public services with a series of governments demanding that austerity be applied so that we can pay the bankers back the money they've lost. So the huge austerity has been applied over the last 10 years. And that's particularly affected the people in the Midlands and the North. So if I can find my figures, Chair, here we are. This is very interesting, this. In the cuts in public spending in the last 5 years, who's had the biggest cuts in public spending? I start. This is how much has been cut from previous levels. East Midlands, the worst. Yorkshire, the next worst. Northern Ireland, the next worst. West Midlands, the next worst. London, also quite a severe cut, but starts from a high level. Who has had an increase in public spending in the last 5 years? The South East, Scotland, the East, and the others more or less the same on the average. So you've seen a huge cut in public spending, but particularly hit the North, the West Midlands, Scotland and so on. Scotland has done well, but the other areas, the East Midlands, West Midlands, Yorkshire, and all the areas in the North have really taken a hit. And this has increased the regional disparities which exist between different parts of Britain. Do you know Britain has the greatest inequality between regions in the whole of Europe? So we have regions which are the poorest compared to the richest. The gap is wider than any other country in Europe. Any other country in Europe. In fact, it goes further than that. I'll just give you an idea. In Glasgow, the average male life expectancy is 73. But in Chiltern, just outside London, it's 83. There's a 10-year gap in life expectancy if you live in Glasgow. The official government data found that the average disposable income per head in the northeast was 16,000 per person. It's 28,000 in London. That gap is wider than anywhere else in Europe. In fact, they found that in parts of Northern Ireland, Wales, and the north of England, production is lower per head than it is in Poland or Romania. That's how seriously the division has developed. No wonder there's a mood amongst people in those areas about London, about Westminster, about the City of London, and what they've been asked to do. Now, you might say, well, what's that? But they were told the reason for this disparity, the reason for the austerity, The reason for the fact that they were in this position is for two reasons. They were told it's the European Union that's done this to you, and it's immigration that's done this to you. Those are the two arguments presented by the Tories, by the rulers of the major parties on the right, the Brexiters and so on, that it's the European Union that has caused this situation for you in the north and so on. So the disparities, the inequalities, the child poverty is the result of the European Union. And there is a feeling, it seemed to be, amongst a section of the population, particularly the older section, my age, that we need to go back and take control and have England as the way it was as I remember it in the 50s and 60s, and it's the European Union that's made this mess. I've got some figures here which shows the disparity on voting on age, which I think is quite interesting. Amongst the 65-plus-year-olds, of course I don't qualify in that, it was 62% who wanted to leave, and only 12% who wanted to stay in the EU. So at the other end of the scale, under 24s, those who voted, it was 57% in favour of staying in the EU, and only 12% to leave. And you work it up, and the turnover, crossover point when the majority swings from remain to leave is at 44. So all the youngsters in the room who are under 44, on the whole, had a majority for remaining in the EU. All the ones above 44 apparently thought that it was better to leave the EU, and in some way this would benefit them. So we had this issue, which was impossible to overcome in the minds of a whole section of the population efficiently. I mean, again, I don't want to exaggerate, because the vote in the referendum was 52-48 to leave the EU. The vote, if you add up Brexit and Remain votes in this general election, was about the same again. It didn't really change. So there's still a vast majority. The country was split. The country was split in regions, it was split in class, it was split in income about whether this was an issue. But everybody was convinced it was an issue that they needed to decide on, and it would make a difference whether they voted one way or the other. And the other one is of course, immigration. Now, since the Great Recession of 2008-9, there was a massive influx of young people, particularly, but of workers and families, but mainly workers, from particularly Eastern Europe that came into Britain, other countries as well, but they came into Eastern Europe in large numbers. There was a major economic crisis in Europe, like there was in Britain, and particularly in Eastern Europe, it was a disaster. So people left, immigration, they left. The Poles left, the Romanians left, Lithuanians left. All those in the Eastern European areas moved across, not just to Britain, but quite a lot to Britain, because people want to learn English, and because the job situation seemed to be better in the UK than in some other places that were like France or Italy, which was also suffering. Spain had a massive emigration, which also ended up in the UK. 3 million people was the increase between 2010 and now in the population of Britain, and a vast majority of that wasn't due to we all having more babies, I'm sorry. It was due to that we had a lot more people coming into the country to do all the jobs that a lot of people don't want to do. It was in the National Health Service, or in schools, or social care, or in leisure, hotels, restaurants. We know this influx came in. And so we have a huge immigration. Immigration has always happened in Britain. I mean, after all, Birmingham, above all one country, a city knows. We go back to the 19th century, the influx of Irish into the Birmingham area for industry and so on, in Liverpool and elsewhere, and after the post-war period, the West Indians coming in, and then Asians later on. It's been a massive process of immigration in waves, in places like Birmingham and so on. This is a new wave, the Eastern European wave. But every time we've had that wave, it's produced tensions and opposition to the idea. And it's interesting to note that the biggest Leave votes were in areas where there wasn't much immigration. It's a fear that in some way this is going to do something. And the rational argument was, well, it's going to destroy our schools. We won't have enough room in the schools. You won't have enough room in the NHS, although most of these immigrants were actually working. So there was, again, another confusion on the question of European Union being the reason for this mess in the economy, and immigration being another serious danger to our way of life, if you want to take it that way, or also to our basic social conditions. And those two factors were sufficient to drive a sufficient number of voters to back a Conservative government to get Brexit done. And as I speak, 2 hours ago, Parliament passed the legislation to actually officially take us out of the European Union on the 31st of January. We're going out, there's no turning back. Then the debate is purely about what terms of trade we have with the European Union after the 31st of January. And by the end of this year, 2020, we will be completely in with our own rules on trade and so on, whatever we agree with the EU or not. We'll be operating that, and that includes controlling immigration. Actually, immigration from the European Union and Eastern Europe has collapsed as a result of this struggle over Brexit, so that we now have quite serious shortages in whole areas of work which the Eastern Europeans were providing before. But the irony to those people who have a racist attitude on immigration is that contrary to it meaning that there's now less immigrants, actually immigration is still rising because it's coming from non-EU countries. And so the irony of this picture that we get out of the European Union and we can control the immigration of Eastern Europe is going to in some way stop immigration, not so far, unless the government wants to change the whole procedures for all people who are not coming from the European Union. That's something still to come. So we have a position then, it seems to me, where there was no way around for the Labour leadership to win this election because Brexit overrode everything that the Labour leadership stood for. But there was another factor, which people have mentioned already, I think, the Corbyn factor. I don't think we can deny that, unfortunately, Jeremy Corbyn, who I know quite well and been in the movement a long time, I've spoken at platforms with him, a decent, good, radical member of the Labour Party who has fought on a lot of issues which are in interests of internationalism and others, was completely crucified by the media for a whole period of time since he was elected, re-elected, and not just by the media, but also by the majority of the parliamentary Labour Party. So what friends are those who are your enemies when they're actually in your parliamentary party dealing with you? But that had an effect, it's had a huge effect. The idea that Corbyn was actually a supporter of Irish terrorism, or we spoke on Iranian TV, or he's actually an anti-Semitic, he hates Jews, all this sort of stuff was presented to the public. And I don't mind saying that Jeremy is a really honest, dedicated socialist. Not the greatest speaker in the world, not the greatest impact. So that has an impact too. And this distrust of the Labour leadership amongst a section of the population, not everybody, again, I don't want to overdo it, also had a bit of an impact. So that was another factor, the Corbyn factor, if you like. And there's one more factor, which people aren't really aware of, Chair, and that was, in the last year or so, actually we've had full employment and wages have picked up a bit. People felt a little bit better than they did 2 or 3 years ago. That has an impact when you have a government, oh, well, things aren't getting better, we don't need to change anything, we don't need to do anything radical, things are getting a little better. We've unemployment at the lowest level it's been for 50 years. That sounds tremendous, doesn't it? But of course we know that the employment that people are getting is absolutely awful. It's low wage, it's precarious, 0 hours, casual, temporary. It's all those factors, but nevertheless it has a little bit of an impact. I think it's a third factor as an economist, which I've looked at this. Every time wages or employment improves, it has a little bit of help for the incumbent government. And that's been the experience of the last year. So 3 factors. The biggest one, Brexit. The second one, Corbyn, unfortunately. The third one, the wages factor. That was enough to give the Conservatives a victory because they coalesced all that antagonism against Labour or Corbyn and the question of Brexit into one party, basically, while everybody else was split all over the place thanks to the help of the media and so on. So, where are we now, Chair? Here we are on the day Brexit is decided. We're going to leave. What's going to happen in the future? What is the Conservative Party policy? Well, I actually wrote just before the election, I think the one thing the Conservative Party will do once they win is that they will start taking over Labour's policies.
Exactly.
And the first thing that's happened is that Javid, Chancellor of the Exchequer, was in Birmingham just in December, and he did an interview and he said, you know, we've got to get rid of austerity. Interest rates are really low. The government can borrow as much as it wants now to spend. We're going to do that. We're going to spend on the north, the northern powerhouse. We're going to give money to the people in the Red Wall who backed us in the election. We're going to spend some money in public services. And we're going to save the NHS. He says, we don't mind spending. Whereas previous governments, Tory governments, cut public spending and cut taxes. Now, we're not going to touch taxes, we're going to boost public spending. Well, we were told during the election that doing such a thing was irresponsible by the media. But now, of course, they don't care. The Johnson-Javid government is quite happy with the idea of this programme. So already some ideas have been taken over by the Conservatives. We've seen only this last couple of weeks, whereas the rail franchise starts falling apart in all directions, now they're going to nationalise this franchise and that franchise, maybe temporarily, but they're not afraid to take it over and run it for the state if it's not working properly. So we're going to get a lot more of this approach, I think, from the Conservative government, which they hope will cement the position that they've got under Labour. But I would like to just say, if I could, what we're not going to get. What we're not going to get is women's pensions that have been delayed by the manoeuvre of the last Tory government to shift the pension age back. That's not going to be dealt with. We're not going to get the NHS cleaned out of market reform and secret privatisation and outsourcing. We're going to get more of that. We're going to get the Americans sending in their health companies to take over the NHS. So we're not going to get that. We're not going to get free social care. Quite the contrary. As somebody said the other day, there's no point in people running down their value of their house to get social care because the councils don't provide it anymore. It's gone. There's no free social care. That was another thing we're not going to get. We're not going to get the end of tuition fees for students. Tuition fees are going to stay. They're not going to disappear. We're not going to get free broadband for every home. That's not going to happen. BT have made sure of that. And we're not going to get a national investment bank that's going to invest in public services and to boost the economy. We're not going to get that. We're not going to get public ownership of the rail. We're not going to get public ownership of the water utility monopolies or the energy monopolies who are racking up billions and billions of dividends for their shareholders and squeezing the consumers as a result. We're not going to get that. So that was basically the programme of the Labour Party. When people did a poll, they found that the programme of the Labour Party was extremely popular. On every single issue, if you took it out on its own and didn't mention Corbyn, you got rail nationalisation, 67%, water utilities, 70%, BT broadband, 66%. Massive popularity for this programme, but it disappeared into nowhere because of one issue, getting out of the European Union. Getting out of the European Union. That's the biggest issue that was faced. So I finished, Chair, because I've only got 2 minutes. So that's the sort of thing. What's going to happen now is we're now, say it's 5 years, Conservative government does not control the economy. Capitalism is an economy that's out of the control of governments. Decisions are made by